They led her up the frozen platform with a limp in her step and a sack of debt on her name. Marin kept her chin up, though the wind bit through her tattered shawl and her boots had worn holes weeks ago. The town square was packed, not with buyers, but with jeering onlookers who'd gathered more for the cruelty than any real transaction. $20 for the girl with the crooked foot, one of the barkers called, laughing. She's barely worth the wood she'll burn. Marin clenched her jaw. She had once been a rancher's bride, a woman who sang to chickens and folded blankets with lavender tucked in the seams. But her husband had died in a barn fire last winter, and with him went the land, the mule, and every ounce of mercy the town ever pretended to have. Now, in the middle of a blizzard, they stood her on a crate and called her a burden, a joke, a debt paid forward. She'll make good kindling for the mountain man, someone muttered from the back. That silenced the crowd for a breath. Even the cruel ones knew the stories, of the wild man who lived near Timberline Ridge, surrounded by wolves and ghosts. No one had seen him in years, not clearly. Some said he wasn't fully human. "Let's make it interesting," the sheriff sneered. "No charge. Just send her to him and see if she comes back." Laughter roared. A few townsmen dragged Marin down from the crate and shoved her into a wagon with no canvas, no fire, just a cracked lantern and a bag of hard biscuits. "Drop her by the ridge," the sheriff told the boy driving. "If he doesn't want her, the cold will finish the job." Hours passed in numb silence. Snow collected on her skirt, on her sleeves, even on her lashes. By the time the wagon stopped, the sky had begun to darken into that strange silver that came before death. "Good luck," the boy said, tossing her blanket after her. She stepped down, trembling into thigh-deep snow, the wind howling like the stories said it would. There was no man in sight. No wolves. Just a clearing, a few scattered birch trees, and smoke, rising thin and steady from the chimney of a small cabin ahead. Marin pulled the blanket tight and began to limp toward it, not knowing if she was walking toward mercy or the end of her name. Marin stood outside the cabin for a long time, her knees knocking with cold and dread, the snow soaking through her skirt as if it were trying to claim her bones. The smoke from the chimney smelled of cedar and something meat-rich, venison, maybe, or rabbit. But there was no sound inside. No voice, no footsteps, no wolf howls, just the crackle of flame and the thump of her own heartbeat in her ears. She thought of turning back, but the wagon was gone, its ruts already filling with snow. So she raised her hand and knocked, not loud, not desperate, just enough to say, "I'm still alive." The door creaked open before her knuckles made contact again. Not all the way, not with force, just a slow groan as if it had been left unlatched. Inside, it was dim but warm, the fire casting long shadows across a room that was spare but not unkind. Furs lined the floor. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters. A pot simmered on the hearth. And beside it, crouched in the shadows, was the man they'd given her to. Marin froze. He didn't rise, didn't speak. His hair was wild and dark, streaked with something pale. Snow or age, she couldn't tell. His beard was thick, not filthy, and his eyes, when they lifted to hers, were not savage, just watchful. Like a hawk assessing whether she was threat or prey. She waited for him to shout, to slam the door, to tell her what price he thought she carried. Instead, he turned back to the pot, ladled soup into a bowl, and pushed it across the floor toward her without a word. Marin didn't move. "Are you him?" she finally asked, voice hoarse. The man said nothing, just reached behind him, grabbed a second blanket and tossed it beside the bowl. Then he stood, tall, broad-shouldered but not looming, and walked to the door. He didn't shut it, just left it open, letting the storm howl through while he disappeared into the back room. An invitation or a warning, she couldn't tell. Shivering, she stepped inside, closed the door herself, and sank to the floor by the fire. She didn't eat the soup. Not yet. But she held the bowl in her lap like something sacred. The room smelled like pine and smoke and something she hadn't felt since before the barn burned. Safety. She didn't know his name. But she'd just been given warmth, and in the mountains' language, that was more than enough. The soup tasted like roots and meat and something ancient, like it had been simmering long before she ever arrived. Maren sipped it in silence, her hands wrapped around the bowl as if it might reassemble the broken parts of her. The fire popped and hissed in the hearth, the warmth finally sinking into her feet, which had gone blistered and pale. Her boots sat near the flames now, drying slowly, while she watched the cabin breathe. Every shelf held something carved or foraged, a set of antlers above the doorway, a bundle of feathers tied with sinew, a birch bark bowl filled with dried berries. This wasn't madness. This was ritual. Whoever he was, he had made a life out of survival. When he returned from the back room, his arms were full. A pile of firewood, a strip of bandages, and what looked like a carved wooden box. He didn't speak, but set the wood beside the hearth and knelt across from her. His eyes flicked to her feet. Maren stiffened. "They're fine," she said too fast. "Just cold." But the lie hung in the air like steam. He opened the box. Inside were cloths, dried herbs, and a small clay jar that smelled of spruce and bear fat. Maren blinked. She wasn't sure what shocked her more, that he had medicine, or that he would use it on her. Slowly, without touching her, he pointed at her feet, then the ointment. A question. She hesitated. Then, wordlessly nodded. He knelt, knee to the ground like a man in prayer, and lifted the edge of her skirt. Gently, no leer in his eyes, no heat, just quiet attention. Her feet were cracked, bleeding at the heels, blistered along the toes. He didn't flinch, just dipped his fingers into the salve and began to work, warm hands spreading the balm with reverence. Maren looked away, tears springing fast and unexpected. No man had touched her since the fire. Not like this. Not without taking something. When he finished, he wrapped her feet in clean cloth, then rose and stoked the fire higher. Still silent. Still watching without watching. As he turned to return to the back, Maren found her voice. "Why did you help me?" He paused, looked at her, really looked, then spoke for the first time. Just 3 words, rasped low like wind through pine. "You were cold." Then he vanished into the dark again, and Maren stared at the fire, the warmth on her feet suddenly matched by something glowing in her chest. Morning came with a hush, the kind of silence that blankets mountains before the wind dares return. Maren woke on a bed of furs near the hearth, her feet still wrapped in the salve-soaked cloths, the blanket from last night pulled all the way to her chin, though she didn't remember doing it herself. The man was gone, or so it seemed, but fresh tracks in the snow outside the window told her he hadn't gone far. She rose slowly, each step testing the tender ache beneath the bandages. She crossed the cabin cautiously, taking in more than she had the night before. The row of handmade arrows leaned against the doorframe, the long hunting knife set in a carved sheath, the bundle of herbs labeled in neat Lakota script she couldn't read. Everything had purpose. Everything had care. He wasn't a savage. He was exact. She stoked the fire the way she remembered her husband doing, and when she opened the cupboard in search of a cup, she found a flat rock with etched lines scratched across its surface. 10 marks per row, as if he was counting something. Days? Winters? Visitors? She didn't touch it. She didn't touch anything that felt like it had blood memory in it. When the door opened, and he stepped in with snow-dusted shoulders and a brace of rabbits over his arm, she froze. He nodded to her, not surprised to see her standing. Then, to her confusion, he stepped aside and beckoned with a motion of his hand, for her to come outside. She followed. The wind bit hard, but the view stunned her into silence. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley, and far below, a creek still moved, thin as thread but alive. He handed her a wooden staff carved with feathers and gestured to the trail winding down to the creek. "Walk," he said, the word hoarse but clear. "Not far." "Why?" she asked. He looked at her feet, then at her eyes. "Cabin rules," he said. "Fire, food, walk, every day." She almost laughed, but didn't. He wasn't joking. It was how he stayed human, she realized. A rhythm. A vow against madness. She limped forward. The staff steadied her. Snow crunched underfoot. Behind her, he moved slowly, not guiding, not guarding, just walking with her. And for the first time in many months, Maren felt like she wasn't being punished for surviving. She was simply being taught how to begin again, one quiet step at a time. That night, after their walk and a shared meal of rabbit stew and foraged roots, Maren sat by the fire mending one of her boots with sinew thread he had given her. The cabin had slipped into a rhythm. No words, just tasks. She learned when to stoke the fire, how to dry meat above the stones, how to hang herbs without ruining their oil. He never told her what to do. He simply did things, and she noticed. And in noticing, she remembered that she was still capable of learning, of adapting, of belonging somewhere. He moved like an animal, but not the kind people feared, more like a great elk, powerful, deliberate, aware. She had begun to hum again, not out loud, not yet, but in her mind, as she sewed and stirred and swept, old tunes from her childhood circled her fingers. It was on the 5th night that she noticed the blanket by the door. Not the heavy fur one for sleeping, but a smaller woven one, folded neatly on a bench beside the entry. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. When he saw her looking at it, he paused by the hearth, then stepped over and lifted it, gently, carefully, and laid it across her shoulders. Maren stiffened. It wasn't the act of kindness that undid her. It was the fact that it had her name embroidered into the corner, clumsily but clearly. Maren. Her breath hitched, her eyes flicked to his. He didn't explain. Didn't offer where he'd found the thread or how he knew to spell it. He simply nodded, then crouched beside the fire and added a log. "I thought," she whispered, voice brittle, "I thought I was brought here to die." He stirred the coals with a stick, not looking up. Then he spoke, slow, measured. "They give the snow what they don't want to bury." The words struck her like wind against bare skin. Cold. True. She pulled the blanket tighter, feeling not just warmth, but something sacred. He had not just given her fire. He had given her proof that she was seen, that her name was worth keeping. That someone, even a mountain man with scars on his hands and silence in his bones, believed she was more than the waste of a town's shame. That night, she didn't sleep on the floor. He motioned her toward the cot in the back, then laid his own furs down beside the hearth. And when she whispered, "Thank you," into the dark, she swore she saw the shadow of a smile curve across his face before he turned away. The thaw began in small betrayals, ice loosening on the eaves, birds returning one sharp cry at a time, and Maren's feet no longer wincing at the cold floorboards. Spring didn't arrive all at once in the mountains. It crept like guilt, inching through branches and bones. But inside the cabin, something else bloomed faster. One morning, while preparing tea with pine needles and dandelion roots, Maren noticed him watching her. Not by accident, not in passing, but like he was remembering something he hadn't dared hope for. "What?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her heart had picked up speed. He blinked once, then answered in that gravel-soft voice. "You braid your hair different now." She touched the back of her neck, surprised. She had been tying it tighter each day, not realizing it had changed. "I used to wear it loose," she said. "When I was a bride, before." The word "before" settled between them like ash. He stirred the fire. "Loose hair is for girls," he said simply. "Braided means you've decided to stay." She froze. "Stay?" He didn't look at her, just added, "In my people's way, when a woman braids her hair in a home, it's hers." The fire popped. Outside, a bird called once, then again. "I didn't know that," she whispered. He nodded, slow. "I did." She stared at him, the heat rising to her cheeks in a way that had nothing to do with the flames. "Is that why you never asked me to leave?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then, in the quietest voice she'd heard from him yet, he said, "I've been waiting." Her throat tightened. "For what?" "For you to call it yours." She turned then, slowly, fully, taking in the man she had feared, then trusted, then needed. His face wasn't soft, but it wasn't stone anymore either. His scars didn't seem so harsh. His silence no longer felt like absence. "What if I don't know how?" she asked. "To belong again." He stood, not fast, not sudden, just as a tree rises against wind. Then he reached for the basket of firewood, placed it between them and said, "Then we begin like this." And he placed a second blanket beside the hearth, next to hers. Not overlapping, not apart. And Maren understood. He wasn't offering to rescue her. He was offering a place where she could arrive fully, with limp, with silence, with story. And for the first time, the word home didn't ache. It breathed. The wind changed direction that week, curling in from the west and bringing the smell of earth instead of snow. Maren began waking before the fire had gone out, her hands moving to tasks without needing thought. Soaking beans, sweeping ash, hanging more of the braided herbs he showed her how to tie. She didn't ask questions about his past, and he never asked about hers, but in that silence, something fuller bloomed. Trust didn't come like thunder. It came like steam rising from morning tea, visible only if you were still enough to notice. One afternoon, while she was gathering kindling, she found something buried just beneath the frost. A carving. Small, oval, smoothed with time. She wiped away the dirt and turned it over in her palm. A woman's figure etched into wood, wrapped in flame. Her chest tightened. When she brought it back, she didn't ask whose hands had carved it. She simply placed it on the mantel. He saw. He nodded. That night, as they sat by the fire with their knees nearly touching and the stew bubbling low, he spoke her name aloud for the first time. Not you, not girl, just Maren. She startled, then smiled. "You said it right," she murmured. "How did you know?" He tapped his temple once. "I hear better than I talk." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But you should know mine." She sat straighter. "I'd like that." He looked at the fire, not at her, and said quietly, "Kalek." The word felt solid, like carved stone. She repeated it, slower. "Kalek." He nodded once. "Means quiet shelter in my mother's tongue." The name struck her deep, not because of what it meant, but because of how perfectly it fit. He had never tried to save her. He had simply made space for her to remain unbroken. "Is that what this place is?" she asked. "Shelter?" Calic turned toward her then, fully, his eyes steady, reflecting the flames. "No," he said. "You are." She blinked. "What?" "You walked here, carried your pain, your story, your feet into the snow. You made the fire stay lit. You didn't run when silence came." He leaned forward, voice lower now. "You weren't given to die. You were given to begin." Her breath caught. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a confession. It was a naming, a recognition. And in that moment, Maren understood why he had never touched her beyond medicine or blankets or firewood. Because some men don't claim what the snow delivers. They wait until it speaks back, until it says their name in return. That evening, as twilight melted into the long hush of night, Maren found herself staring at his hands while he carved. Calic sat on the step just outside the cabin, a half-finished wooden spoon in his grip, the blade of his knife catching the last bits of sun. His fingers moved slow, careful, never wasting effort. She'd noticed them before, the way his left pinky bent wrong, how the backs of both hands bore pale lines and burns. But tonight, the shadows shifted just enough to show the one scar he never seemed to cover. It ran from the base of his neck to the edge of his collarbone, jagged like lightning etched into flesh. Without thinking, she stepped closer, wrapped in her wool shawl, and sat beside him. The silence between them wasn't empty. It brimmed. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, her eyes on the mark. He didn't stop carving. "Only when I forget it's there." She let the words settle before replying. "Who gave it to you?" He paused. Then, in that way he always had, he told the truth without decoration. "A man who thought I'd forget who I was if he left his name in my skin." She looked at him, throat tight. "And did you?" "No." His jaw flexed. "But it took time." A long silence followed. Then, slowly, she reached out and traced a fingertip near, but not on, the scar. "I have ones no one sees," she said. "Burned on the inside. They say I stopped speaking after the barn fire. But really, I just stopped being heard." Calic met her gaze, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "You don't have to explain," he said. "I hear you." A pause. Then he added, quieter still, "I've always heard you." Maren's throat closed, not from grief, from the ache of being known, truly known. "Why me?" she asked. "Why did you take me in?" He looked down at his hands. The spoon now rested in his palm, unfinished. "Because I saw a fire dying in the snow, and I knew what it meant to be too far gone for rescue. But still worth saving." Her heart beat once, loud in her ears. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in deerskin. He placed it in her lap. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a necklace, woven with beads and feathers, and at its center a smooth stone etched with a single word in Lakota. "It's your name," he said, "but not the one they gave you. The one you earned here." Maren didn't speak. She just clutched it to her chest, and didn't let go. The next morning broke open with a hush so vast it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Maren stood at the ridge outside the cabin, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the wind catching the edge of her braid. Below, the valley shimmered with frost and early melt, the creek threading like silver between the pines. Calic stood a few paces behind her, sharpening his blade with slow, steady strokes. She hadn't told him yet, but she was leaving. Not to abandon, not to escape, but to return, for one final time, to the town that had thrown her away, to collect what little of her past hadn't already been turned to ash. Letters. A wooden box with her mother's hairbrush. A name on a page she hadn't signed herself. She turned. "I need to go down tomorrow," she said. His whetstone paused. "Alone?" She nodded. If I'm going to stay, I have to choose it fully. He didn't protest, didn't lecture, just nodded once, then resumed the slow scrape of stone against steel. That night, she packed light, only what she needed to return with. No shame, no silence, just the steadiness she'd found in herself. But when she opened the cabin door at dawn, a bundle was already waiting on the step. Inside, a woven blanket, a pouch of smoked meat, and the carved spoon he'd never finished. On the handle, newly burned into the wood, was her name. Marin. Not in Lakota, not in English, just in her own hand. When she turned, he was there. Coat on, eyes unreadable. I'll walk you to the tree line, he said. She nodded. They walked without speaking, side by side, down the trail they'd walked so many times before. But this time, each step rang with something different, a parting, not an ending. When they reached the edge of the woods, where the path veered toward town and the mountains faded behind, she turned. Do you want me to come back? She asked, her voice barely more than breath. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled a thin strip of leather from around his neck, a ring strung on it, silver, worn smooth by time. He placed it in her hand. Only if you bring this with you, he said. Her lip trembled. What is it? It was my mother's, he replied, and if you come back wearing it, it means you're not returning as a guest. Marin didn't cry. Not yet. She simply nodded, clutched the ring, and turned down the path. And as she walked, the snow beneath her feet melted, not from the sun, but from the fire she carried now. Fire she would never again forget. Spring in the valley didn't roar in. It arrived in quiet color. The snow pulled back like a curtain, revealing moss and crocus beneath. Birds stitched the air with song, and the cabin, once cloaked in silence, began to breathe again. Cowboy spent his days repairing the roof, carving a new beam, tending to the hillside garden he'd begun before the last freeze. But every evening, just before dusk, he'd sit on the porch steps and look down the trail with a stillness so absolute it ached. He didn't speak of her, but her shawl still hung by the hearth. Her spoon remained on the shelf. And her name, now burned into wood and memory, lingered in every corner. Then, on the 30th day, the wind shifted. He felt it before he heard it, saddle creaking, breath catching, hoof on thawed earth. When he looked up, she was there. Marin, in the same coat but a new braid, walking alongside a borrowed mare, her face half shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. She wore no shame, no fear. Only that ring around her neck, now slipped onto her finger. She stopped a few paces from the porch and didn't speak. She didn't have to. He stood, and for a moment neither moved. Then she stepped forward, held out her hand, and said softly, I remembered how to come home. Cowboy didn't smile in the usual way. His expression barely shifted. But his eyes, they opened, deep and bright, and full of something that had waited too long. He took her hand, then opened the cabin door. That night, she sat beside the fire again, weaving a new cord for the necklace. You know, she said, voice steady, they tried to stop me. Said I was mad for coming back to a ghost in the mountains. He stirred the stew. Am I a ghost? She smiled. Number just a man who knew how to wait without demanding. When they ate, she added salt without asking, and he didn't flinch. When they cleaned, she hummed, and he matched her rhythm. And later, as the fire dimmed, she took the ring from her finger and placed it in his open palm. Now you say it, she whispered. He looked at her, then at the ring. Say what? She asked. Cowboy leaned in, close enough that the firelight danced in both their eyes, and with breath like the mountain wind, he said the only words that mattered now. "Welcome home, Marin." And she was. At last. Forever. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If you'd been there when she returned with nothing but that ring, would you have believed she still belonged? Tell us in the comments.